At 9:17 on the morning of January 22nd, 1943, a 27-year-old lieutenant is about to pull the trigger on a rifle his commanding officer called a toy. 240 yards away, hidden 87 feet up in a banyan tree, sits a Japanese sniper who's already killed 3 American soldiers. In the past 72 hours, 11 enemy snipers operating in these groves have killed 14 men from the 132nd Infantry Regiment. The lieutenant's name is John George. He's an Illinois state shooting champion with 0 confirmed combat kills. Every other soldier in his battalion carries a standard-issue M1 Garand. George has a Winchester Model 70 sporting rifle he bought with 2 years of National Guard pay. A mail-order hunting rifle his fellow officers have been mocking for 6 weeks straight. They called it his mail-order sweetheart. Captain Morris ordered him to leave it in his tent and carry a real weapon. George carried it anyway. The battalion commander gave him one morning to prove this civilian rifle could actually kill something. If George fails, 14 dead Americans will have died for nothing, and the Japanese snipers will keep picking off soldiers one by one. If he succeeds, everything the U.S. military thinks it knows about sniper warfare is about to change forever. George controls his breathing, adjusts for wind, and squeezes the trigger. What happens over the next 4 days will make military history. But first, let me tell you how a state shooting champion ended up in a Pacific jungle with a rifle nobody believed in. When George unpacked his Winchester at Camp Forest, Tennessee, the armorer wanted to know if it was meant for deer or Germans. George told him it was for the Japanese. Then the unit shipped out before the rifle arrived. George spent the entire voyage to Guadalcanal watching other men clean their Garands, while his own weapon sat in a warehouse back in Illinois. He had to request it be forwarded through military mail. 6 weeks later, in late December 1942, a supply sergeant handed him a wooden crate marked Fragile. Inside was the rifle he'd been waiting for. The Winchester weighed 9 pounds. The Lyman Alaskan scope added another 12 ounces. Compare that to the Garand at 9.5 pounds with no magnification whatsoever. George's rifle was bolt action, 5 rounds. The Garand, semi-automatic, 8 rounds. On paper, George had brought an inferior weapon to a modern war. Captain Morris didn't just suggest George leave the sporting rifle in his tent. He ordered it. George carried it anyway. There's a particular kind of confidence that comes from being an Illinois state champion at 1,000 yards. George had won that title in 1939 at age 23, youngest winner in the state's history. He could put 6 rounds into a 6-inch group at 600 yards with iron sights alone. With the Lyman Alaskan scope, he could place 5 rounds inside 4 inches at 300 yards. But none of that mattered to the men who'd been fighting since August. The 132nd Infantry had relieved the Marines on Guadalcanal in late December. The Marines had taken Henderson Field and held it, but they hadn't taken Mount Austin, and they hadn't cleared the Japanese from the coastal groves west of the Matanikau River. Mount Austin stood 1,514 feet tall. The Japanese called it the Gifu. 500 men in 47 bunkers. George's battalion attacked on December 17th and fought for 16 straight days. They lost 34 men killed and 279 wounded before they finally took the western slope on January 2nd, 1943. In all that time, George fired his Winchester exactly 0 times in combat. The jungle around Point Cruz turned out to be different. No bunkers, no fixed positions. Just Japanese soldiers who'd retreated west from Henderson Field and dug into massive trees. Some of those soldiers were snipers with scoped Arisaka Type 98 rifles. They knew the jungle. They knew how to wait. On January 19th, a sniper killed Corporal Davis while he was filling canteens at a creek. January 20th, another sniper killed 2 men from L Company during a patrol. January 21st, 3 more men died. One of them was shot through the neck from a tree the patrol had walked past twice. That night, the battalion commander summoned George. The Japanese snipers were killing his men faster than malaria. He needed someone who could shoot back. George explained his credentials: Illinois State Championship, expert marksman ratings. The commander gave him until morning. George spent that night checking his rifle for the third time. The Winchester had been packed in Cosmoline for the ocean voyage. He cleaned every component again, checked the scope mounts, loaded 5 rounds of .30 .06 hunting ammunition he'd packed back in Tennessee. At dawn on January 22nd, George moved into position in that captured bunker overlooking the coconut groves. He'd brought no spotter, no radio man, just his rifle, a canteen, and 60 rounds of ammunition in stripper clips. The Lyman Alaskan scope offered 2.5 power magnification. Not much by today's standards, but enough to see movement in branches the naked eye would miss. The jungle was never silent. Birds, insects, distant artillery. George had learned to filter out the noise and focus on movement. He glassed the trees slowly, left to right, top to bottom. At 9:17 in the morning, he saw it. A branch moved with no wind, just a small shift. 87 feet up in a banyan tree, 240 yards away. George watched. The branch moved again. Then he saw the shape. A man in dark clothing, positioned in a fork where 3 branches met. The Japanese sniper was facing east, watching the trail where American soldiers had been moving supplies. George adjusted his scope. 2 clicks right for wind. He controlled his breathing the way he'd done thousands of times on ranges back home. The Winchester's trigger broke clean at 3.5 pounds. He'd spent hours adjusting it at Camp Perry before the war. Now, he'd find out if a civilian target rifle could kill a man trained to kill him first. George squeezed the trigger. The Winchester kicked into his shoulder. The crack echoed through the jungle. 240 yards away, the Japanese sniper jerked and fell. He dropped through the branches, his body tumbling 90 feet before hitting the ground near the base of the banyan tree. George worked the bolt. The empty cartridge ejected with that distinctive brass ring. He chambered another round and kept his scope on the tree, waiting. Japanese snipers worked in pairs, 1 shooter, 1 spotter. If George had just killed the shooter, the spotter was somewhere close. George scanned the surrounding banyans methodically. The scope's limited magnification forced him to search slowly. At 9:43, he found the second sniper in a different tree, 60 yards north of the first. This one was lower, maybe 50 feet up, and he was moving down the trunk. He'd heard the shot and knew his position was compromised. George aimed, led the movement, and fired. The second sniper fell backwards off the tree. His rifle clattered through the branches ahead of him. Both rifle and body hit the jungle floor within seconds of each other. 2 shots, 2 kills. George reloaded. From a stripper clip. His hands were steady. This was no different than shooting at Camp Perry, except here the target shot back. At 11:21, that reality caught up with him. A Japanese bullet struck the sandbag 6 inches from his head. The impact sprayed dirt into his face. George rolled left and pressed himself against the bunker wall. The shot had come from the southwest, a different direction than the first 2 snipers. George waited 3 full minutes before moving. Basic sniper doctrine says you shoot and relocate, but in jungle this dense relocation options are limited. George inched back to his firing position and glassed the trees to the southwest. He found the shooter at 11:38, third tree from the left in a cluster of 5 banyans 73 feet up. The Japanese sniper had repositioned to a different branch, but remained in the same tree. A mistake. George put the crosshairs on the dark shape and fired. The third sniper fell without making a sound. By noon, George had killed 5 Japanese snipers. Word spread through the battalion fast. Men who'd mocked his mail-order rifle now asked if they could watch him work. George refused every request. Spectators drew attention. Attention drew fire. The Japanese adapted after the 5th kill. They stopped moving during daylight. George spent the entire afternoon glassing trees and seeing nothing. At 1600 hours, he returned to battalion headquarters. Captain Morris was waiting, and the mockery was gone from his voice. He wanted George back, in position, at dawn. January 23rd began with heavy tropical rain that turned the jungle floor into mud and made trees invisible beyond 100 yards. George sat in his bunker and waited. The rain stopped at 8:15. By 8:45, enough visibility had returned for work. George spotted his first sniper of the day at 9:12. The Japanese soldier had climbed into position during the rain. Smart move. The sound of rain masks movement. This sniper had chosen a tree 290 yards out, longer range than yesterday. Also smart. They were learning his capabilities. George compensated for distance and fired. The sniper fell. That sixth kill brought a response George hadn't anticipated. At 9:57, Japanese mortars began hitting the area around his bunker. They'd triangulated his position based on muzzle flash or sound. The first rounds landed 40 yards short. The second salvo landed 20 yards short. George didn't wait for the third. He grabbed his rifle and ran, sprinting north along the tree line before diving into a shell crater. The third salvo obliterated the bunker he'd occupied moments before. George relocated to a fallen tree 120 yards north of the destroyed position. The tree provided cover and a clear view of the groves. The Japanese sent more snipers that afternoon, and now they were hunting him as much as he was hunting them. The dynamic had shifted. This wasn't target shooting anymore. This was a duel. At 2:23 in the afternoon, George killed his seventh sniper. At 3:41, he killed his eighth. This one had climbed high, 94 feet up, excellent concealment, but height creates a silhouette against the sky when the sun angle changes. At 1700 hours, Captain Morris sent a runner to bring George back. He'd been in position for 9 hours. Morris wanted numbers. George reported 8 confirmed kills over 2 days, 12 rounds fired, 8 hits, 4 misses. Morris assigned him to continue sniper operations starting at dawn on January 24th. That night, George cleaned his Winchester and did the math. 11 Japanese snipers had been operating in the Point Cruz groves. 8 were now dead, 3 remained, and those 3 would be the best. The ones who'd survived the longest. And now they knew exactly what George looked like and exactly what rifle he carried. George loaded 5 fresh rounds and tried to sleep. At 3 lows in the morning, he gave up and sat in his tent with the rifle across his lap. The rain started again at 4:15. By 5:30, it was heavy enough. That dawn operations would be delayed. George used that time to move to a new position, not the bunker, not the fallen tree, somewhere the Japanese wouldn't expect. He chose a cluster of large rocks the Marines had used as a machine gun nest back in December. The position offered good cover and overlapping fields of fire into the groves. At 7:43, the rain slowed to a drizzle. George began glassing trees. At 8:17 on January 24th, he found sniper number 9. The Japanese soldier was positioned in a palm tree, 190 yards out, only 40 feet up. Unusual. Most snipers climbed high for better sight lines. This one had chosen concealment over elevation. The palm fronds created a natural hide invisible from ground level, but George was elevated on the rocks, and the angle gave him a view down into the fronds. He could see the dark shape of the sniper's shoulders and head. George aimed, controlled his breathing, and began to squeeze the trigger. Then he stopped. Something felt wrong. The position was too obvious, too easy. George had been hunting snipers for 3 days. He'd killed 8 men. The remaining 3 wouldn't make elementary mistakes. They wouldn't position themselves where an elevated shooter could spot them unless it was bait. George lowered his rifle and scanned the surrounding trees. If the sniper in the palm was bait, the real shooter would be positioned to cover him, watching for anyone who took the shot, waiting for muzzle flash. George glassed the trees methodically, left to right, top to bottom. Every tree within 300 yards of that palm, it took 11 minutes. At 8:28, he found the real threat. A banyan tree 80 yards northwest of the palm, 91 feet up. The Japanese sniper had positioned himself in a perfect hide. Branches and vines concealed him from 3 sides. He had a clear line of sight to George's previous position at the fallen tree. He was waiting for George to appear there or to take a shot at the bait in the palm tree. George had 2 problems. First, the real sniper was watching the wrong location. If George fired at him now, the sound would reveal George's actual position, and the sniper would relocate before George could work the bolt and chamber another round. Second, if George did nothing, the sniper would eventually realize George wasn't at the fallen tree and begin searching for him. George decided to use their trap against them. He aimed at the decoy sniper in the palm tree, adjusted for wind, and fired. The decoy jerked and fell from the palm. George immediately swung his rifle toward the banyan tree 91 feet up. The real sniper would react to the shot. He'd turn toward the sound. That turn would create movement. George saw it. A slight shift as the sniper repositioned to face George's location. George put the crosshairs on the dark shape and fired before the sniper could fully turn. The real sniper fell. His rifle tumbled after him. 2 shots, 2 kills. But George had revealed his position to anyone else watching. He grabbed his rifle and ammunition and ran, moving east along the rock line before dropping into a drainage ditch 40 yards away. He pressed himself into the mud and waited. At 8:34, Japanese machine gun fire raked the rocks where he'd been positioned 6 seconds earlier. The bullets kicked up dust and stone fragments for 17 seconds straight. When the firing stopped, George counted to 60 before moving. He relocated again, this time to a shell crater partially filled with rainwater 100 yards east. George settled into the crater with water up to his chest, rested the Winchester on the crater rim, and resumed glassing trees. 10 confirmed kills, 1 remaining. The 11th sniper would be the best, the smartest, the most experienced. He'd watched 10 of his comrades die over 3 days. He knew George's tactics, knew his rifle, knew his approximate location, and somewhere in those trees he was watching, waiting, planning. George scanned the jungle through his scope. At 9:47, he realized his mistake. The 11th sniper wasn't in the trees. He was on the ground, and he was moving toward George's position. George caught the movement at the edge of his peripheral vision. 60 yards south, low to the ground, a shape moving through undergrowth parallel to the tree line. The Japanese sniper was using jungle floor vegetation for cover, ferns, vines, fallen branches. He was crawling toward George's last known position at the rocks. George remained motionless in the water-filled crater. The Winchester was already shouldered, breathing controlled, but the angle was wrong. The crater rim blocked his view of the approaching sniper. George would have to rise up to get a clear shot, and rising up would expose him. The Japanese sniper stopped moving at 9:52. He'd reached a position 40 yards from the rocks and was studying them, searching for any sign of his target. George waited. Patience is the primary skill of sniper work, the ability to remain still, to let time pass, to wait for the right moment rather than force a bad shot. At 9:58, the Japanese sniper began moving again, crawling forward. 35 yards from the rocks, 30 yards, 25. He was approaching from the south side, the side George had used when he evacuated under machine gun fire. George understood the tactic. The Japanese sniper had watched that machine gun attack. He knew George had moved east from the rocks. He was now working his way along the most likely escape route, hunting George the way George had been hunting him. At 10:03, the Japanese sniper reached the rocks. He moved into the old machine gun nest and took up a position facing east, toward the drainage ditch, toward the area where George should have relocated. The sniper was now 38 yards from George's actual position in the water-filled crater. His back was exposed. George had a clear shot, center mass, 38 yards. An easy shot, even without a scope. But George hesitated. This sniper had survived 10 days of American operations in the Point Cruz Groves. He'd outlived 10 other snipers who'd been killed because they made mistakes. This man wouldn't make mistakes. The position in the rocks was too exposed, too vulnerable. No experienced sniper would remain there for more than a few seconds. This had to be another decoy. George kept his scope on the sniper in the rocks, but expanded his awareness to the surrounding area. If this was bait, the real threat would be positioned to cover it, somewhere with line of sight to anyone who took the shot. At 10:06, George found it. A second Japanese soldier, 70 yards northwest of the rocks, behind a fallen tree trunk. This soldier wasn't moving, wasn't repositioning, just watching, waiting. His rifle was aimed toward the drainage ditch where George should have been hiding. 2 men, not 1. The 11th sniper had brought support, or perhaps these were the final 2 snipers, numbers 10 and 11, working together. George made his decision. He couldn't shoot both men before they reacted. The bolt-action Winchester required him to work the action between shots, giving them time to locate him and return fire. He needed a different approach. George slowly lowered himself deeper into the water until only his eyes and the top of his head remained above the surface. He kept the Winchester pointed skyward to keep water out of the barrel. Then he waited. At 10:13, the Japanese soldier in the rocks stood up. He'd spent 10 minutes watching the drainage ditch and seen nothing. He believed George had moved farther east. He turned and signaled to his partner behind the fallen tree. Both men began moving east, parallel to each other, 70 yards apart. They were executing a sweep, planning to flush George out or find his position. George remained in the water, motionless. The 2 Japanese soldiers moved past his crater. They were now between George and the tree line, their backs exposed. George rose from the water slowly, silently. Water dripped from the barrel, from his uniform, from his face. He brought the Winchester to his shoulder and aimed at the closer soldier, the one who'd been in the rocks, now 42 yards away. George fired. The soldier dropped. George worked the bolt, chambered another round, swung the rifle toward the second soldier behind the fallen tree. The man was turning, raising his rifle. George fired first. The second soldier fell. 11 shots fired over 3 days. 11 Japanese snipers dead. George had cleared the Point Cruz Groves of the threat that had killed 14 Americans in 72 hours. But as George climbed out of the crater to retrieve his spent cartridges, he heard something that made him freeze. Voices. Japanese voices coming from the tree line. Multiple men moving toward the fallen soldiers. George had killed the snipers, but the snipers hadn't been working alone. George dropped back into the crater. The water was cold, muddy. He submerged until only his eyes remained above the surface, holding the Winchester vertically to keep the barrel clear. The Japanese voices grew louder. At least 6 men, maybe more, moving toward the 2 dead snipers. George could hear branches breaking, equipment rattling. These weren't snipers. Infantry, a patrol or recovery team sent to collect the bodies. The voices stopped at the location of the first body, 42 yards from his crater. Close enough that George could hear them clearly, even without understanding the words. Then the voices moved to the second body. More conversation, urgent tones. At 10:28, the voices began moving again, but not back toward the tree line, toward George's crater. They'd found his tracks. Boot prints in the mud leading from the rocks to the crater. George had been careful about noise and movement. He hadn't been careful about tracks. George had 5 rounds in the Winchester, 6 Japanese soldiers at minimum. Poor odds for a bolt-action rifle. The voices grew closer, 30 yards, 25 yards, 20. At 10:31, a Japanese soldier appeared at the crater rim, looking down directly at George. Their eyes met. George fired from the water. The soldier fell backward. George worked the bolt while still submerged, chambered another round, rose up. 2 more soldiers were at the crater rim. George fired, worked the bolt, fired again. Both soldiers dropped. 3 rounds left. George could hear shouting, more soldiers moving toward him. He climbed out of the crater on the north side, away from the approaching voices, and ran 20 yards before dropping behind a fallen tree. Japanese rifle fire cracked through the jungle. Bullets struck the ground around the crater, around the fallen tree. The soldiers were firing at movement, at sound, not at confirmed targets. George stayed low and glassed the area through his scope. He saw movement. 2 soldiers advancing toward the crater, 50 yards out. George aimed at the lead soldier and fired. The soldier dropped. The second soldier dove for cover. 2 rounds left. George heard more voices behind him. The Japanese were flanking, one group approaching from the south, another from the east. George was about to be surrounded. He made his decision. He couldn't win a firefight with a bolt-action rifle against multiple soldiers with semi-automatic weapons. He needed to break contact and move back toward American lines. George grabbed his rifle and ran north, sprinting through jungle undergrowth. Vines caught his boots, branches whipped his face. Japanese rifle fire followed him. Bullets snapped past, struck trees, kicked up dirt. George ran for 90 seconds before diving into another shell crater. This one was dry. He pressed himself against the crater wall and listened. The Japanese voices were distant now. They hadn't pursued. They were regrouping around their dead. George checked his rifle. Mud on the stock, water still dripping from the barrel. He had 2 rounds left and no stripper clips. The clips were in his pack, and the pack was somewhere near that water-filled crater. At 10:47, George began moving. Again, not running, walking, staying low, using terrain for cover. He moved northeast toward American lines. At 11:13, George reached the American perimeter. A Marine sentry challenged him. George identified himself. The sentry led him through. George walked to battalion headquarters and reported to Captain Morris. Morris wanted a full debrief. George provided it. 11 Japanese snipers killed over 4 days. 12 rounds fired against the snipers, 11 hits. Then a firefight with infantry, 3 more kills, 5 rounds total in that engagement. Morris asked about ammunition status. George was down to 2 rounds. Morris asked about the rifle. George said it was functional but needed cleaning. Mud in the action, water in the barrel. Morris told George to clean his rifle and rest. No operations tomorrow. The battalion was moving east. The Point Cruz groves were no longer a priority. The Japanese were evacuating Guadalcanal. George returned to his tent and spent 2 hours field stripping the Winchester, cleaning every component with Cosmoline and gun oil. He ran patches through the barrel until they came out clean, checked the scope mounts, adjusted the eye relief, loaded 5 fresh rounds. At 1400 hours, word came down from division headquarters. The battalion commander wanted to see George. George walked to headquarters wondering if Morris had filed a negative report for unauthorized engagement or excessive ammunition expenditure. Instead, he found Morris and 2 other officers waiting. One of them was Colonel Ferry, the regimental commander. Ferry had one question. Could George train other men to do what he'd done? George said he could try, but it would require time and rifles with optics, and men who could already shoot. Ferry said division had 14 Springfield rifles with inertial scopes, sniper rifles left behind by the Marines. Ferry had 40 men in the regiment who'd qualified as expert marksmen before deployment. Ferry wanted George to create a sniper section, train the men, develop tactics, clear any remaining Japanese snipers from American operational areas. George accepted, but he had one condition. He wanted to keep his Winchester. Ferry approved the request. Training began on January 27th, with 40 men assembled at a makeshift range 2 miles east of Henderson Field. They were expert marksmen on paper, qualified with iron sights at ranges up to 500 yards. But none of them had combat experience as snipers. None of them had killed a man from concealment. George started with fundamentals: breathing control, trigger squeeze, reading wind. The Springfield rifles with inertial scopes weighed 11 pounds, heavier than the Garand, heavier than George's Winchester. The weight made them stable but tiring to hold for extended periods. George taught them to use any available support: rocks, logs, sandbags. The jungle rarely offered perfect shooting positions. Range training lasted 3 days. George had the men shoot at stationary targets from 100 to 400 yards, then moving targets, then targets partially concealed by vegetation. By January 30th, 32 of the 40 men could consistently hit man-sized targets at 300 yards under field conditions. George divided them into 16 two-man teams, shooter and spotter. The spotter carried binoculars and a Garand. His job was to locate targets and provide security while the shooter engaged. After each kill, the roles could switch. On February 1st, George took 4 teams into the field. Their mission was to clear Japanese positions west of the Matanikau River. Intelligence indicated small groups of Japanese soldiers were still operating in that area, not snipers, just infantry stragglers who hadn't evacuated yet. The 4 teams moved into position at dawn. George paired with a spotter named Corporal Hayes. They set up on high ground overlooking a trail the Japanese had been using for resupply. At 7:20 in the morning, a Japanese soldier appeared on the trail. Hayes confirmed the target through binoculars. George fired. The soldier dropped. Over the next 6 hours, George's team engaged 7 more Japanese soldiers on that trail. 7 shots, 6 kills, 1 miss due to wind. The other 3 teams reported similar results. 23 Japanese soldiers killed that day, 0 American casualties. The sniper section continued operations through early February. By February 9th, the section had killed 74 Japanese soldiers. That number was conservative, only counted confirmed kills where the body could be observed. The Japanese evacuation accelerated during this period. Destroyers arrived at night to pick up troops from Cape Esperance on the western tip of Guadalcanal. American forces pushed west to interdict the evacuation, but the Japanese fought effective rearguard actions. George's sniper section was tasked with eliminating Japanese soldiers covering the retreat routes. On February 7th, George was operating near the Tanamba River when a Japanese rifleman shot him. The bullet struck George in the left shoulder. The impact spun him around and knocked him down. Hayes dragged George to cover and called for a corpsman. The wound was serious, but not fatal. The bullet had passed through muscle without hitting bone or major blood vessels. George was evacuated to a field hospital near Henderson Field. Doctors cleaned the wound and sutured it closed. They told George he would recover but needed rest. No combat operations for at least 3 weeks. George spent 2 weeks at the field hospital. During that time, the Japanese completed their evacuation of Guadalcanal. On February 9th, American forces reached Cape Esperance and found it empty. The campaign was over. George's sniper section had operated for 12 days. 74 confirmed kills, 0 friendly casualties during sniper operations. The section was officially recognized by division headquarters. Colonel Ferry recommended George for a Bronze Star, but George's war wasn't finished. While he recovered at the field hospital, orders came down from Pacific Command. The Army needed experienced combat officers for a new mission. Something in Burma, something classified. George volunteered. By March, George was on a transport ship heading west across the Pacific. His Winchester Model 70 was packed in a waterproof case in the cargo hold, the Lyman Alaskan scope wrapped in oilcloth. George didn't know the details of the Burma mission. He only knew it involved jungle warfare, long-range patrols, operations behind Japanese lines, the kind of mission where a man with a rifle that could hit targets at 600 yards might prove useful. The transport reached India on April 3rd. George and 200 other officers were briefed on their assignment. They would join a new unit, 3,000 men total. The unit had no official designation yet, but the men called themselves something else. They called themselves Merrill's Marauders. The 5307th Composite Unit was officially designated on May 28, 1943, but the men had been training since April. Long-range penetration tactics, jungle survival, operations without supply lines. The unit was modeled after British Brigadier Ord Wingate's Chindits, small mobile forces that could operate deep behind enemy lines for extended periods. George was assigned to the 2nd Battalion. His role wasn't officially listed as sniper. The Army didn't have formal sniper positions in its table of organization. George was designated as a rifle platoon leader, but Colonel Ferry's recommendation had followed him from Guadalcanal. Battalion command knew what George could do with a rifle. Training took place in central India. The terrain was different from Guadalcanal, but the principles remained the same. Heat, humidity, dense vegetation, limited visibility. Burma would be worse, steeper terrain, heavier rainfall, and an enemy that knew the ground better than any American force. George modified his equipment for the Burma mission. The Winchester had performed well on Guadalcanal, but that had been short-range operations with regular resupply. Burma would involve patrols lasting weeks, hundreds of miles through jungle. Every ounce of weight mattered. George removed the Lyman Alaskan scope and replaced it with a lighter Weaver 330, same 2.5 power magnification, but weighed 8 ounces less. He also replaced the wooden stock with a lighter synthetic version. The modifications reduced the rifle's weight from 9 pounds 12 ounces to 8 pounds 14 ounces. Not much, but over a 2-week patrol carrying 60 pounds of equipment, every ounce mattered. The Marauders entered Burma in February 1944. Their mission was to advance through northern Burma and capture the Myitkyina airfield. The airfield was critical for Allied supply routes into China. Japanese forces controlled the area with approximately 4,000 troops. The Marauders would approach overland through terrain the Japanese considered impassable for large forces. Mountains, rivers, dense jungle, no roads, limited trails. The force would carry all supplies on their backs or with pack mules. No motorized transport, no artillery support, just rifles and mortars and the ability to move fast through impossible terrain. George's battalion began the march on February 24th. The first week covered 83 miles through mountainous jungle. Men collapsed from exhaustion. Malaria cases increased daily. Pack mules struggled with the terrain. Several had to be shot when they broke legs on steep descents. By March, the battalion had covered 217 miles. They'd engaged Japanese forces 12 times. Small skirmishes, ambushes, quick firefights, followed by rapid withdrawal. The Marauders weren't meant to hold ground. They were meant to move, to harass, to cut supply lines, and create chaos behind Japanese positions. George used his Winchester 3 times during that march. Once at 412 yards against a Japanese officer directing troops at a river crossing. Once at 380 yards against a machine gun position. Once at 290 yards against a sniper who'd pinned down a Marauder patrol. 3 shots, 3 kills. George never fired more than once per engagement. The Winchester's report was distinctive, different from the Garands' sharp crack. One shot announced his presence. A second shot would give the Japanese time to locate him. George learned to shoot and move immediately. The march to Myitkyina took 3 months. By late May, the Marauders had covered over 700 miles. They'd lost more men to disease than combat: malaria, dysentery, typhus. The unit that entered Burma with 3,000 men was down to fewer than 1,200 effectives. On May 17th, the Marauders captured Myitkyina airfield. The operation was a success, but the cost had been severe. The unit was combat ineffective. Too many casualties, too many sick, too much time in the jungle without rest or proper medical care. George survived the Burma campaign. His Winchester survived. But the rifle that had proven so effective on Guadalcanal had been used only 7 times in 3 months of operations. The Marauders rarely engaged in the kind of long-range precision shooting that required a scoped rifle. Most combat was close-range ambushes at 50 yards or less, firefights in dense vegetation where you could barely see 30 feet. George realized something during those 3 months. The Winchester Model 70 was an excellent rifle, perhaps the best bolt-action sporting rifle ever made. But modern warfare was changing. Semi-automatic rifles like the Garand were becoming standard. The next war would require different weapons, different tactics. But there would be no next war for George, not immediately. By June 1944, he was evacuated from Burma with the rest of the Marauders. The unit was disbanded. George was reassigned to training duties in the United States. He never fired his Winchester in combat again. George returned to the States in July 1944. The Army promoted him to captain and assigned him to Fort Benning, Georgia. His job was training infantry officers in marksmanship and small unit tactics. He taught the lessons he'd learned on Guadalcanal and in Burma, how to move through jungle terrain, how to identify and engage targets at distance, how to operate independently without supply lines. He kept his Winchester Model 70. The rifle had traveled from Illinois to Tennessee to Guadalcanal to India to Burma to Georgia. It had killed at least 14 enemy soldiers in confirmed engagements, probably more. George had stopped counting after Burma. The rifle sat in a footlocker in his quarters at Fort Benning. George rarely looked at it. The war had changed. The Pacific Islands were being retaken one by one. American forces were advancing through France and into Germany. The need for individual marksmen with privately owned rifles was fading. The military was standardizing, mass production, interchangeable parts, soldiers with identical equipment and identical training. George understood the necessity. Modern warfare required industrial scale. But something was being lost. The individual skill, the craftsman approach to soldiering, the idea that a man with the right rifle and the right training could change the outcome of a battle. George was discharged from the Army in January 1947 as a lieutenant colonel with 2 Bronze Stars, a Purple Heart, and a combat infantry badge. He returned to Illinois and enrolled at Princeton University on the GI Bill, studied politics, graduated with highest honors in 1950. After Princeton, George spent 4 years at Oxford, then 4 years in British East Africa, studying regional politics and institutions. He eventually settled in Washington, D.C. as executive director of the Institute of African American Relations. Later, he joined the State Department's Foreign Affairs Institute as a consultant and lecturer on African affairs. George never spoke publicly about Guadalcanal or Burma during those years. He had colleagues who knew he'd served in the Pacific, but they didn't know about Point Cruz. They didn't know about the Japanese snipers. They didn't know about the Winchester. George was discharged from the Army in January 1947 as a lieutenant colonel. 2 Bronze Stars, a Purple Heart, a combat infantry badge. He returned to Illinois and did something nobody expected. He enrolled at Princeton University on the GI Bill. Think about that transition. 4 years earlier, he was killing enemy snipers in Pacific jungles. Now he was sitting in lecture halls studying politics. George graduated with highest honors in 1950. After Princeton, he spent 4 years at Oxford, then 4 years in British East Africa studying regional politics and institutions. He eventually settled in Washington, D.C. as executive director of the Institute of African American Relations. Later, he joined the State Department's Foreign Affairs Institute as a consultant and lecturer on African affairs. George never spoke publicly about Guadalcanal or Burma during those years. He had colleagues who knew he'd served in the Pacific, but they didn't know about Point Cruz. They didn't know about the 11 Japanese snipers. They didn't know about the Winchester Model 70 that sat in a case in his home. The rifle that had traveled from Illinois to Tennessee to Guadalcanal, to India to Burma, to Georgia to Washington, D.C. The rifle that had changed military history was sitting in a closet while George lectured diplomats about African politics. That obscurity was intentional. George never wanted to be known for killing. He wanted to be known for thinking, for teaching, for solving problems. The 11 snipers were a problem he'd solved in January 1943. The lack of African expertise in American foreign policy was a problem he spent 30 years solving. Both mattered to George, but only one defined how he wanted to be remembered. But in 1947, shortly after his discharge, George made one concession to his combat past. He decided to write down what had happened, not for glory, not for recognition, just for the record. He wanted to document the weapons and tactics of jungle warfare while the details were still fresh in his mind. George wrote for 6 months. The manuscript grew to over 400 pages, dense, technical descriptions of rifles and ammunition and ballistics, detailed accounts of what worked and what didn't work in actual combat. No embellishment, no hero worship, just observations from a man who'd been there and survived. A friend at the National Rifle Association read the manuscript and immediately pushed for publication. George was reluctant. The book was too technical, too detailed. Who would want to read 400 pages about rifle specifications and jungle tactics? But the NRA convinced him, and in 1947, Shots Fired in Anger was published. The book became an instant classic among firearms enthusiasts and military historians, but more importantly, it became required reading for a new generation of military snipers. George had written the first comprehensive American text on combat sniping by someone who'd actually done it at the highest level. Previous military manuals were theoretical, written by range instructors. George wrote from experience, and that authenticity gave the book credibility no theoretical manual could match. Shots Fired in Anger is still in print today, 77 years later. Still used as a reference by collectors, historians, and military professionals studying World War II small arms. George's descriptions of Japanese weapons remain some of the most detailed contemporary accounts available. His tactical observations about jungle warfare are still relevant. The Winchester Model 70 sections are particularly fascinating. George wrote about that rifle with clinical precision, its strengths, its weaknesses, what made it effective, where it failed. He never claimed it was the perfect weapon. He just explained what it could do in the hands of someone who knew how to use it. If this story moved you the way it moved me, I need you to do something right now. Hit that like button. I'm serious. Every single like tells YouTube's algorithm to show this story to more people who need to hear it. Real stories about real people who changed history quietly without seeking credit, just by being excellent at what they did. Hit subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on those notifications by clicking the bell. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single week. Stories about people who solved impossible problems with skill and determination and a refusal to accept this is how things are done. Drop a comment right now and tell me where you're watching from. United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, Germany, Japan. Our community stretches across the entire world, and every comment helps this channel grow. Tell me your location. Tell me if someone in your family served in World War II. Tell me if you'd ever heard about John George before this video, because I'm betting most of you hadn't. I hadn't either until I started researching Guadalcanal snipers and found this story buried in military archives and a 77-year-old book that deserves to be more widely read. That's what we do here. We find the people who history forgot or never noticed in the first place. The soldiers who won battles without making headlines. The officers who changed doctrine without writing manifestos. The individuals who proved that one person with the right skills and stubborn determination can shift the course of events. John George was one of those people, and somewhere in Fairfax, Virginia, in a climate-controlled museum case, sits the proof. A Winchester Model 70 that looks like any other hunting rifle, but it's not. It's the rifle that killed 11 Japanese snipers when everyone said it couldn't. The rifle that proved civilian marksmanship mattered in modern warfare. The rifle that launched a doctrine still taught today. The rifle that changed everything Most people walk right past it. But you won't. Because now you know the story. Now you know that mail-order rifle wasn't a toy. It was a revolution wrapped in walnut and steel, carried by a man who refused to leave it in his tent. Captain Morris called it a mail-order sweetheart. The other officers laughed. 11 Japanese snipers stopped laughing after 4 days. The United States Marine Corps made it standard issue 23 years later. And John George spent the rest of his life being remembered for his mind instead of his rifle, which is exactly what he wanted. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being part of this community. Thank you for making sure John George and men like him don't disappear into silence. These stories matter. These people matter. And you're helping keep their memories alive. Rest in peace, Lieutenant Colonel John George, 1915 to 2009. Your legacy lives on in every military sniper who trains today, every precision shot, every life saved by someone who learned from what you taught. They mocked your mail-order rifle. You proved them all wrong. And 76 years later, we're still telling the story. I'll see you in the next one.